But I want to get into your background for a bit. Back to your childhood for a moment. You grew up in Culver City, California.
Yes.
Your father had gone to USC and was also in the business. Did you just naturally, young, early age, gravitate to like show business in general? Did it just like catch on to you like very quickly as a young person?
Yeah, I guess it probably depends on people's belief in DNA and all that stuff, that it seemed like this was what I was destined to do from the beginning. But I did have the influence of a father that, was a magician, a fire eater, went through vaudeville, then came out to study film at USC. And it was like the first year that they were actually teaching film classes. But when he went into the industry, it's like, film school? Are you kidding me? No,
Yeah.
you have an uncle. Don't you know anybody in this business? And of course he didn't. So he struggled to get whatever job he could get, shooting
Yeah.
news footage on his 60 millimeter camera or whatever. And then whatever gigs he could get in the movies, being a fire eater in a number of different films, including Nightmare Alley, which obviously Del Toro just remade a little while
Mm.
back. And just, lots of stuff where there was carnivals, circuses, medieval, he would be in there. But he was frustrated because it wasn't the dream that he had to, be a filmmaker. So I was born and kind of inherited that dream and his equipment. And of course, I couldn't afford to shoot 16 at 7 years of age, but I got a hold of an 8 millimeter. And so
Mm.
that I could, jump the fence or crawl under the fence, which depends what part of the lot I was in. And with my friends, we'd make movies in the back lot of MGM. So the backgrounds always looked good. We were pretty shitty. I mean, we didn't know what we were doing, but we were having fun, doing
Yeah.
monsters and, action things and all that in 8 millimeter. So it certainly was the passion that I had, from the very beginning with that.
Yeah, there was an interview with Arnold Schwarzenegger and his son recently where his son was talking about just being on film sets as a kid,
Yeah.
visiting all the film sets kind of put the passion into him
Yeah.
more than anything else, just like being around it. So
Yeah.
I felt like probably you were around a lot of that growing up. So, but also I understand that you also had a strong pull towards music very early on. I believe you went to a festival and very quickly early on in your teen years had started a band. So was it like sort of, were you pulled in both directions, filmmaking and music? Was one taking more preference over the other as you got older? Like,
Well, it's strange, Vic, because it's like my life seems to be in these 10-year things. Like the first 10 years, well, probably closer to 12, I guess, on the first thing of wanting to be a magician. Like my father did shows where I would get paid, do kids' parties or whatever, and then use that money to make my little films. So that was really where my passion was, and the monsters, the Universal monsters and stuff. Then when the Beatles hit in '62, then everything shifted, and I sort of let that go and went into rock and roll. And we
mm,
were all teenagers, but we opened, I mean, like 14, 15, 16-year-old teenagers, but we were opening for the Doors, Iron
wow.
Butterfly, you know, Pink Floyd. There were so many, whatever was coming to town, the Animals. So we would get into these clubs and nobody would card us or anything. And we just,
Mm,
we're rock and roll guys. And that was kind of took me up to, 1970. So the 60s were all the rock and roll. And then 70s, I wanted to be more of an interesting lead singer. So I went to Paris and studied mime with Marcel Marceau. So then the next 10 years was, starting as a street performer, putting together an act with my girlfriend, who was eventually my first wife, who was a performing partner, and then put together a group called the LA Mime Company. And then Dick Van Dyke came and saw us perform somewhere and put us on his show. So it all kind of just evolved. But once I was on the Van Dyke show, I wrote and directed, the sketches that Dick did with us, as well as whoever was the guest star. So suddenly at 27, I'm directing Lucille Ball and Freddie Prince and Tommy Smothers and Chevy Chase and Flip Wilson and, whoever were the big, TV stars and,
wow.
Carol Burnett. I mean, just legends. And here I was, this punk kid that, had this mime training and had a kind of a passion for pantomime and in the classic like silent movie way, not the white face mime,
Mm,
much more
okay.
old school. Um, And that eventually kind of shifted into me, writing screenplays. And the first one was a horror movie with very little dialogue, One Dark Night. And then that got me on the thing of wanting to write and direct, which kind of carried me through the rest of my career with a little bit of the producing kind of on some of those things. And then in 2011, the band thing came back into my life. Somebody hunted down the members of the Sloths, which was the group I was part of back then. And there was a record called Making Love that couldn't be played on the radio back there just purely because of the title. But it was found out to be like a cult hit overseas, and these music publications would do these articles. And so we found ourselves going, hey, why don't we get the band back together again, 40 years later, and started performing. And, we were then more popular, then, because it's like, oh, I thought all these guys from the Sunset Strip were dead, and we were like one of the last sort of surviving, still doing it bands, which was a, great time. And then COVID put the kibosh on that, ended that tour, never released our second album. So I've put a new band together currently called Slothzilla, which is basically taking not the songs that we did, but taking the kind of the flavor of what I've always wanted to do, which is combining horror and rock and roll. And basically it's taking songs that have been in horror movies that a lot of certain people don't realize, oh God, that was in that film. Or if you're familiar with the horror movies, it's like, oh God, this is from, and some of them are like no brainers, like Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Pet Sematary, or Sympathy for the Devil, and Interview with a Vampire. But it's like over 50 songs, which of course we're not going to be doing all of them, but we're trying to sort of cherry pick the best ones. I'm a big advocate of performing, so if you come to see, it's a show. It's not just us standing there doing the songs. I do costume changes, I do magic, I do special effects, I do all kinds of shit up there. And we're trying to keep a band together, which is never easy, whether you're 20 or 70.
Yeah.
It's like, because there's no money in the beginning, and lots of times no money ever. You just have the passion to do it. But we have an upcoming show at a horror convention, Crystal Lake Con, that's going to be here in Los Angeles in, I guess it's top of August. Be kind of the premiere of the band. And then hoping to do more conventions as well as just, clubs and things. And I'm hoping that people will get the vibe of what we're trying to do, which is celebrate, both these songs that are incredible, as well as, the movies that they're in, and have clips and different things that are all part of the presentation.
And during your filmmaking journey, all the years in between, had you been on the side still doing musical things on your own, or was it just like a complete break from music until the band got back together?
Pretty much a complete break. Yeah. Sing at church, and that was about it. The rest of it was
shower, church. I'm sure. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like I never lost the passion for it. And I did a number of movies with Valerie Bertinelli, and that opened me up to a friendship with Eddie Van Halen. So, Valerie and Eddie and me and my wife at that time, Nancy, would go all these places. They came over for Halloween to do trick-or-treating with Wolfie, and, my daughter, how old? I guess they were like 4. Her and Wolfie are the same age. And my daughter had her first kiss by Wolfie Van Halen in England when we were doing Turn of the Screw over there. And when I'd go to the concerts with them and be on the side of the stage, in the wings, I sat there going, shit, I wish I would have done rock and roll. This is just so exciting, to watch them. And this guy I knew back in the 60s, named Vincent, who was from Texas, who had a band called the Naz, and we were on the same bill many times, ended up turning into Alice Cooper. which
Mm,
just a strange coincidence because I literally have not seen him since '66. Yet, hired him, to do the songs that are in Friday the 13th, but
right.
we still not crossed paths. And
Oh
even
wow.
though I do Man Behind the Mask as part of the rock and roll show, Alice heard that and he told some fan, yeah, we got to do that together.
Oh
And
yeah.
so hopefully I'll get that bucket list thing
Mm.
happening at some
Oh yeah.
point.
Got to. Yeah. Um, okay. And so, in looking at your background, it does seem you've had a lot of amazing sort of people you've come across. You talk about Lucille Ball, Woody Allen, The Doors. One name that I want to ask you about. Do you recall? I guess you took a class for Rod Serling.
Hmm. Yeah.
Any memories of that? Because, like, to me, Twilight Zone is. I think Rod Serling is somebody who is actually underappreciated in terms of a writer. And I was watching an interview with Ryan Coogler, who did Sinners, and he actually mentioned that an old Twilight Zone episode was a huge influence on Sinners, which shows how impactful Twilight Zone still is.
Yeah.
So I was like, that caught me because, like, I've watched Rod Serling interviews on YouTube and just seemed like a really fascinating guy. Can you tell us anything about that experience?
Oh yeah. I was very fortunate. There was uh, a guy, um, Gary Shuzette, who very nerdy looking guy. I mean, sort of person you would find at the horror conventions who knows everything,
Mhm.
But he was a guy that just had this passion that he wanted to create a school. And it was very funky because he'd go and knock on people's doors. I mean, big stars, or Stallone and some of these people, and get them to come down and do a class. And then once it kind of took off, he had like 6-week comedy class with Lucille Ball.
Mm.
I mean, all these great comedians would come in and do seminars on comedy. And one of the ones was screenwriting with Rod Serling.
Mm.
So, of course, I was there in a millisecond, front row center, and,
Right.
you know, write down everything that this man said. And as you know, the way he speaks and growing up with that, it was just, like
His
major mentor,
his command and dialect, like just the way he speaks off, like it's just like wow, like
Yeah.
this guy another level. So yeah, 100%.
But the surreal thing that I cannot ever not mention is the fact that he was a chain smoker and he smoked the heavy filterless cigarettes, and he would inhale, huge inhale, and then he would start talking, and it's like, where's the smoke? Where's it's, I never saw it come back out again. And part of me
Oh
thinking,
man.
that's not good, and of
Yeah.
course, eventually that was his downfall. And
Uh,
same thing with David Lynch. David just would not give up the cigarette smoking, and, all this stuff eventually takes its toll.
yeah.
But as a genius, both of those guys, it's like, okay, well, that was their vice. And, everything else is about, creating. And that was part of the relaxation that they needed, I guess, to do it. Just like certain people need a drink, or certain people, need to, snort Coke or whatever before they
Yeah.
get out there.
I guess historically, even like great artists of the past, always maybe there was something there, some kind of substance, drug, something. So it's like it's tied in a way to creativity. I would say historically, a lot of old historical creative people. So that makes sense to me. Um, so okay, now I do want to ask you a bit about the your process, your writing process. So you're not only been directed a lot, you've written a lot also. For you, writing wise, do you outline? Do you go right into your first draft? Do you like, are you a big planner ahead of time, or you just like jump in and let the story take you? Like, take us into kind of your writing process. If you have the initial idea for a script, and like, where are you starting at then from there?
Well, it's been an interesting, I guess you would say, series of events that occurred as a writer that sort of gave me first sort of confidence that I could do this, and then kind of veered off. In other words, like when I was 12, the year before, my mother had a mental breakdown, and that kind of, I was the oldest, so it took my reality and completely flipped it, because suddenly my mother's not my mother, and she had to go into a hospital, and I had to kind of take care of the kids below me, the other four younger ones. And it was like, I guess you could say, Peter Pan syndrome, where lost a childhood and had to get very adult and mature. But I retreated into Edgar Allan Poe. And years later, when I started seeing Fellini movies, when I'd go and visit my mother, there were all these people that were, hello, I'm William Shakespeare, hello, I'm Marilyn Monroe, so happens that the hospital she was at was where Marilyn was at one point in her life. And it just, kind of threw me into that world of horror, of lost love, as Poe would write about. So I started writing poetry, in that vein. And then when songs, when the band came together, songs started to take on much more of it put more pressure on me. So I started obviously writing poetry that were then lyrics for songs. And once I shifted into mime, now I'm writing sketches. And that was one thing that I could do really fast. It's like I would have an idea for something, like, taking the illusion that you do in mime with the invisible wall and coming up with a sketch called, The Glass Shop, and Dick Van Dyke, be coming into this glass shop and he'd keep running into glass, and you'd have to feel his way around it, go around and run into it. And he did such a brilliant job, with executing it. But I had that thing of like, okay, I got an idea for this, and I could just, in a half hour, bang out beginning, middle, and end. So I got kind of spoiled. It was too easy. When I got into screenplays, now it's like, okay, you get an idea. And like my first one had to do with being in Paris and go down into the catacombs and feeling that sense of supernatural fear, where I broke away from the group with my little candle and kind of felt all the stuff that I imagined Edgar Allan Poe's work was kind of, and it gave me that sense of, okay, there's nobody chasing me. There's no one with a knife. There's nobody with a gun. Just why am I afraid, with all these skulls and bones around me? Well, that was the thing that kind of made me want to do One Dark Night, because it set it in a mausoleum, where they were all behind marble. And that was the beginning of that thing of, okay, something in life impresses you and you write about that. I look at the film now, and it's, it's very, to me, hollow in terms of characters, because in those things, you don't delve too deeply into the people. You just get a basic sense. Okay, this is the bad guy. This is the daughter. This is Meg Tilly's character is one that got picked on. The other one were bitches that teased her and stuff. But from there, going into the Friday the 13th, that was a whole different thing, because again, it's like, okay, I got to come up with 110 pages, 115 pages.
Yeah.
A lot longer of a process. But when I got hired, it's sort of like, well, we need to get this thing out. So there was a deadline. I went to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, where I'd write by hand, wrote it in screenplay fashion, but it was all done exactly the way a script would look, and give it to a typist, and then they would type it up and I'd turn it in. But that was probably maybe a 3-week process at the most. First did a treatment, which is in the back of the book that Joe Maudry did on me, called The Strange Idea of Entertainment, to see what the treatment was, which is pretty much what the movie was. And I was fortunate just to go, okay, here's all these ideas, and let me see if I can put them all together and also have the comic tone with it as well. But that treatment is in the back of the book. So for anybody that kind of wants to see kind of, if you're a writer, it's like, oh, here's a way it's all sort of outlined and told as a story. And then I had to go back and then, turn it into a screenplay. And so the process was literally kind of steps. And then once that went out and we made the movie, the next thing I wanted to do, because my mentor at that point was Frank Capra. And what does Capra have to do with that? And I go, well, what I got from him is that movies are a people-to-people medium. If you like the people up there, you care about them, hopefully, you care about the movie, because it can't be just wonderful shots and incredible scenes. It's got to be invested, in those characters. So that's the one thing I tried very hard to do with the Friday the 13th is have you go, oh no, you didn't kill. I liked her. I liked him. So as opposed to going to the movies at that time, I'm talking about, in the 70s, and you go and see it with the, what I call the Yahoo crowd, every time there
Mm.
was bloodletting, oh, they
Yeah.
crazy. Or there'd be guys going, yeah, kill that bitch. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and,
Right.
I did not want to do that, with mine, but have a sense of kind of ironic humor, through it. But it's like, when I was teaching film, I kept saying to the students, it's not a question of coming up with something brand new. Everybody wants to do something never before been seen. Everything
Mm.
seen, everything, but what you need to do is find some way that you can identify and connect with these characters that are going through this particular story,
Right.
so that you care enough. And even if it's Hannibal Lecter, he made you laugh.
Yeah.
You were enjoying him. The end of the movie wasn't so dark and scary as it could have been. It's, he had a sense of humor about having this guy over for dinner,
Right.
and that's the kind of stuff that I learned from, and that's the type of stuff I tried to pass on to film students. Is, it's a mashup. You take comedy and horror, put it together. You take romance and horror and put it together. You find something dramatic that has enough conflict that you need to eventually get to some sort of resolution. But along the way, how are you telling the story? What is the tone? Is it something that's fun? When recently I saw the Oz Perkins, Last Thing the Monkey. And
Oh, yeah. I just watched that last week myself. Yeah. That was a very interesting movie. Yeah.
it
I
is,
liked
but
it. Yeah.
I couldn't help saying, isn't this a Twilight Zone? Or it certainly felt like one,
Yeah.
boys first, monkey comes back. But of course, he put all kinds of crazy,
Yeah.
horrible deaths and some shock deaths and other things to it. But it did have that sort of sense of classic Twilight Zone storytelling, as well as, a sense of fun, which was so different, obviously, from Longlegs, which, has been my favorite movie the last couple of years. Literally,
Okay.
I found myself going, oh my, because I knew nothing about him, his past, anything, and sat there going, I just felt immersed in that world that he created. Then I found out that he was Anthony Perkins' son, and I found out that the big shock in his life was finding out his father was gay, something his mother kept from him, which is the same thing as the storyline, in Longlegs. Mother never said, what happened to the daughter, yet she was haunted by this thing. And then, Oz also lost his mother in 9/11 on one of those planes. I can't imagine the baggage that you carry around with those two things happening, that just kind of derailed you on one sense, but also focused you in on creating, but something that kind of coming out of your knowledge, your experience.
Kind of like, yeah, it's informing your work going forward. I mean, I guess probably probably all creatives too. It's like your life experience probably it's gonna show up in your writing. Probably, I'm guessing in certain ways. Certain characters are gonna reflect you.
And it's got to be that way, because then, to me, that's the only way you can really be truthful. Is that, I know this, I went through this, I felt this. As you know, so many movies are carbon copies of another movie. They inspired by it, so I'm going to do that. Or of course, The Wonderful World of Sequels, where well, they liked it once. Let's see if they like it again. 9 out of 10 times, people are going, it's just the same thing again. Some people don't mind. A lot of people really like, you want to go that next level somehow. And what I always talk about is, don't try to go off and, which to me, it was a problem with Jason. Suddenly he's no longer at Crystal Lake. He's in outer space. He's going to New York. He's on a boat. And the ideas are like, okay, that sounds like that could be fun, but it gets away from what made the original work. So, I wrote a sequel to my Friday, which is, once again, set in the Crystal Lake thing, but with a freak snowstorm in November. And now we're going to see it in, heavy duty snow, like, like John Carpenter, The Thing, kind of, caught in that world. So it takes the environment, still makes it claustrophobic, even more so, and also kind of change it up so it's all teenage girls from high school who are badass girls who have been brought there by a Catholic nun, because they go to Catholic school, to be basically to come with some sort of redemption. It's like a spiritual weekend, and Jason comes up through the frozen Crystal Lake,
Wow.
because I'm kind of picking up 13 years after I put him down in that lake, and sort of going, all right, this is like a lost manuscript that somebody put together. They found in the bottom of a church, in the basement,
Mm.
and kind of made it so that, again, trying to do something different, but still enough of the same thing that you go, okay, I can
Yeah.
still hopefully get that same vibe that the Good Fridays had.
Yeah, I think if you ask Friday the 13th fans, there's sort of a yearning to return to the kind of the more basic sort of what it originally was, like the
Mhm.
first couple ones. Uh, the series did go in different directions, obviously, Manhattan, space. So I think there is always a yearning to like I think the Crystal Lake TV show, I think people are excited about that, but they're also kind of like, okay, well, let's see what they're doing here with this, because this is obviously going to be a whole different format type of storytelling for Jason, for this world, a TV show.
Yeah.
So when you're directing, like say the first couple of days on a movie set, what's kind of your mood? Is it anxiety or like a good nervous energy? Like the first couple of days on a movie, like what's kind of your emotional state, like your mood, your vibe? Like are you anxious? Are you just excited? Like what's kind of the vibe in the first couple of days?
I think fear is a great motivator. Fear of failure, fear of not being able to communicate to everybody the right answer. I mean, if an actor, I mean, nothing is more awful than having somebody like Kelly McGillis, who I was working with, and she's in the middle of this very intense scene. And, it's like, and I go, okay, cut. What is it? Give me something. Help me. Help Tom, please come to me. Take my hand. Tell me what it is I'm supposed to be feeling right now.
Mm,
Suddenly, like, holy shit, what do I say? Because to
right.
me it was very clear what was going on, but she just kind of lost her focus and needed something to grab onto. And fortunately, I knew enough about directing at that point that I could give her something just simple enough that didn't require too many words and too much thinking to do.
Mm,
When those moments come along, you just terrify you're not going to give them, the right answer. And there was just that thing of having a crew that in the beginning, if they don't know you, it's like, well, let's see what this guy's got to say, because
mm.
the director sets the tone of the thing. And I try to be part of the crew, not this is my picture, this is our picture. And what do you want to do in this scene? How do you think the lighting should be? How do the more I can get them to participate and feel like it's, our movie and not my movie, the easier it is. And it took a time to get to that.
Once you got the job, and my understanding is that you were able to go back and watch the first 5 movies. They screened them for you at Paramount.
Mhm.
Um, did you have a favorite amongst the first 5? Like, what was it when you watched those? Like, what did you take away from watching the first 5? Were you taking like what you don't want to do in your film? Were you taking like the things that you liked about? And was there one amongst the first 5 that you liked more?
Well, I had seen the original, which I liked very much. I thought that they, took Halloween, because again, it purely happened because Halloween was such a success. And John Cunningham thought, okay, I got to do something like that that's going to be cheap to shoot, deliver, the thrills and chills. And then, of course, the kills. You look at Halloween and you look at the original Friday. I mean, the violence level is, and what you actually see on screen is day and night. But that really kind of revolutionized, the business, where now you had to see the stuff and it had to get more and more intense. But I love the fact that it wasn't, a guy in a mask.
It's 1 o'clock.
With the when we finally find out who the killer is, that it's the
Hmm.
mother, and she was so good. It was like, boy, she's like a total psycho.
Yeah.
And it made it all the more, fascinating. So that I had seen, and then we got hit with all these slasher movies, and wherever I went to pitch something I wanted to do, like One
Yeah.
Dark Night, it was like, you know what, kid, that's a good idea, but if you give me something set in, I don't know, in an abandoned city or, warehouse, something, where somebody's trapped and there's some guy, some sort of something over his head, I don't care what it is, and girls that are, don't mind doing the nudity. And I was like, that's not what I want to do.
Yeah.
So part of the reason I didn't watch all the Fridays is because it just seemed like it was going to be, deja vu all over again. So when I had to sit down and watch them all, and that's kind of what I felt, is that, they kept trying to repeat each other, the previous one in some way, until they got to the final chapter. And I thought Joe Zito, as a director, and whatever they figured out with the script and so on, was like, okay, this is it. We're finishing this up, and they really kind of put in more movie aspects to it, and less just kill somebody, and that's still, when people say, well, what is your favorite Friday? I'd say part 4. I mean, the first one to me is the best, but it's sort of separate from everything that kind of was the clones.
The fourth one had the thing you were talking about earlier, in terms of like, you do actually like the characters, you care about the characters.
Yep.
So by the end of the movie, when those characters start dying, you're actually like, you're feeling for them. You're not cheering for Jason. You're like on their side. And that was, I think, the first of the first 5 that actually, like, oh, there was more detail put into the characters, more like defining specific characteristics. And the others, I don't think necessarily had that. So that I'm with you. I think final chapter also kind of, and also you had Tom Savini back, who was from the first one. So you're going to get amazing death scenes anytime you have Tom Savini involved. So I'm with you on that.
I don't think they expected it to do as big as it did. And so, of course, now it's like, okay, well, it's not the final chapter anymore. We need a new beginning. And the mistake that they made on that, to me, 2 things, one was not realizing that people so like him as a character, you can't have somebody impersonating him. Then at the end, to have, Tommy Jarvis hold the mask up and people going, oh, no, he's going to be Jason now. So they, the word of mouth afterwards was just not good. And, thus I get called, and it's like, all right, normally we do these every 2 years. We got to do this one, a year after, to try to get our audience back. And, Joe Zito, to me, had like chops that, knowing how to make a movie or action movie and stuff. And Danny Steinman, who was doing, part 5, really kind of came out of porno. And you got that sense of the sex was more important to him.
Yeah, I think so again, amongst the fans, it feels like part 5 is like getting more of a cult following. I feel like there's like appreciation for even Roy as the killer and a lot of things about it. So I think there is like a growing fan base for it over the years. But
it has really built. And
but I'm with you. To me, it's like the tone is a little bit off. It's a little bit, I hate to use the word like sleazy, but there's something about that movie that's kind of like a little bit different. And I'm wondering, so was your vibe from, I guess, the studio or Frank Mancuso, like kind of like, was their vibe like, hey, we want you to do something completely different from part 5. We want you to take this in a different direction, or was just like carte blanche, whatever you want to do for part 6?
Well, again, what I was saying I wanted to do scared them, because it's like, you're going to put comedy in it. And it's like, well, I'm not going to make fun of Jason. Jason is still going to be the monster, but now he's unstoppable. This bolt of lightning taken from Frankenstein, is going to empower him. So as far as I'm concerned, he's not a zombie. He's basically a reanimated corpse, because I even have the sheriff shoot him right in the head, and that, nope, he doesn't go down. So it doesn't follow the zombie rules. But be that as it may, it's labeled as the real Jason, and then come part 6, it's now the zombie Jason. And I just said, I want to try to make it. I mean, to me, the good movies is the main characters have an agenda, whatever it is. And in the case of Tommy, he needed to see the body, and another borrowing this time from Bride of Frankenstein in the beginning, where, what was his name, Hans. I got to see his blackened bones, and I can sleep at night. And Tommy needed to see Jason was down there, and he brought a can of gasoline because he was going to burn the body up. And then, of course, fate stepped in. The devil or whatever that caused that lightning bolt to hit.
Damn lightning, man! Damn lightning! Just
and as far as I was concerned, all the classic monsters, Frankenstein, love dead, hate living, that he says in the second one. Dracula, to be dead, to be really dead must be glorious. Wolfman does not want to be the Wolfman. Right. So I thought, okay, Jason was completely at rest, at peace, and this punk comes along and does this thing, and now he's back. So he's got one agenda: I'm going after this guy, and anything in the way, gets killed. So it was less just running around waiting for victims. It was more,
Full
he
speed
was,
ahead. Yeah, right from the beginning.
he was on a roll. Tommy had an agenda, Jason had an agenda, and it was a question of like, who's going to win. And even when Tommy finally succeeds in putting him under there, it's the final girl, that actually comes in and saves the day at the end to kind of, embrace that rule. But we didn't think of it as the final girl. It's just, there's always got to be in the kind of the basic rules of that is the female who's going to seem like the most helpless isn't, and I wanted Megan to be really, really sassy and funny and fun. Yeah. Had no problem talking back to her dad and all that with a dark sense of humor. And so those elements to me, were going to make it different, but it wasn't like I asked their permission on that. I just did it. And the only thing they asked me to take out was I introduced Jason's father at the end of the movie. And where, after Jason's been put down there, there was sort of this epilogue where we go back to the cemetery and the caretakers there, and you see this figure come in with a long coat and almost kind of Svengali-ish, which I was basically stealing from myself with Raymar in One Dark Night. I've always loved that dark look of evil, and I just thought, whoever Jason's father is, there's got to be something in him that might have some supernatural element, that Jason has survived all this time, without any supernatural powers, just pure evil. And, and that sense that the father has on the at the end of the movie of staring at his wife's grave and Jason's grave and sensing something's not right, and then going underwater to see him and his eye, opens. But Frank said, we really screwed up with part 5. And as soon as I thought it was going to be Tommy Jarvis, they were pissed. So as much as I like the idea, I think we got to take the father out, because I don't want people to go, oh shit, the next one's going to be about his dad.
Oh yeah.
Never my intention. It really was just to introduce him, and maybe he would be in the next one, maybe he wouldn't. But it was just a way to say, here's another thing that we haven't seen, and let's build off of that. Somewhere down the line. So I just feel like, have that be the only main note. I was very fortunate that it's like the rest of it. Yeah. Just, make it work.
And so when you're writing it, then are you cautious about how much comedy to put into it in terms of like, okay, so that's a great baseline of like, keep Jason serious. Cause that's obviously whenever a horror villain gets too comedic himself, we saw later Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, sometimes with Chucky, sometimes it doesn't work if they get too comedic themselves, but you can make the world around them as farcical or, as comedic as possible. Were you cautious about just tone wise? Because Jason Lives is an amazing example of like getting the horror and comedy balance perfect. And sometimes you watch horror comedies and it's kind of like, well, they're sort of at odds with each other. It feels like the tone isn't like there, but you did a really good job with Jason Lives, which is keeping that balance at all times. And as you said, keeping Jason scary throughout the movie. Was that like, were you like cautious while writing in terms of how much comedy to put into it, or just it came naturally?
It just came naturally. I mean, I really, like working with Dick Van Dyke and all these comics, and of course, being a mime and basically leaning into this visual comedy world. And when I was directing CJ, a lot of it was, I want that Terminator, I want these turns to be sharp, not the lumpy kind of Jason. You'll see the lumping kind of Jason in the paintball sequence, because, that was a different guy.
Was, Dan Bradley?
Dan Bradley.
Was the paintball scene the only thing with him? And everything else is CJ?
All the exterior, that exterior sequence. We started with that, so because we had to go into nights, because it was going to be 6-day weeks, of nights. And unfortunately, in the bright sunlight, what Paramount saw was that he was really gaining weight, and the costume, was getting tighter. And Frank Mancuso's sister was doing costumes, and she was going, I can't let the pants and thing out any further. I was so busy making the movie, I was not focused on his weight. I mean, to me, it's like, okay, some of the Jasons in the past to me always looked like they were,
Yeah.
loping along and stuff. But for whatever reason, Paramount said, okay, we're bringing, your second choice, which was CJ. And I love CJ from the beginning, but the mandate was we need to hire a Jason who will also be the stunt coordinator. So that way we don't have to hire two people, just one can do both things. Dan Bradley is an incredible stunt coordinator. And of course, after this, he's gone on to, do all the second unit for the Bond movies, for the Bourne Identity movies and stuff. He is like the number one go-to guy. So he didn't need fucking Jason. I mean,
right.
Made a whole big career for himself out of that. But yeah, in terms of like being aware, because of my influences from Frank Capra, from Howard Hawks, from the 30s and 40s directors that had this wise guy banter, that I've always loved, and creating slang that doesn't really exist, but it sounds right at the time, and I did that both in One Dark Night. Well, I guess in One Dark Night and Date with an Angel, as well as Friday. People always had other ways of saying things that a lot of it really, really stuck. And once the cast kind of saw where I was going, like Vinny Gustafaro, who played the deputy, and I had wherever the red dot goes, dot, 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 he went, can I go, you bang?
Oh, yeah.
And you bang is
he leaned into it perfectly. So yeah, the delivery it's like one of those memorable lines. Like the line itself and the way he delivers it, both like super memorable. So
and then Little Rascals had a big influence on me. So what were you going to be when you grew up? That thing has really stuck with a lot of people. And just sometimes just random things like that. I saw the book No Exit, in the shelf of books in the cabin that the boys were in, and I said, here, hold this on your chest here. That gets a huge laugh, from an intellectual standpoint, and just from the fact that it says no exit. If you don't even know what that book was, it still was a visual gag. So a lot of stuff just sort of like happened as I was writing it, and as I was shooting, we'd find things. But yeah, it was never really a conscious effort.
I've seen enough horror films to know not to like mess with a guy. Yeah. That's got to be like the earliest self-aware thing in a horror film and that's going to basically like kind of like something that I would say like in Scream like 10 years later, but there wasn't that much of that. It felt like in the 80s in terms of that level of self-awareness, already lampooning the guy in the mask. That's like really, really good.
Well, here's the great irony. About, I don't know how many years it was after mine that I got this script called Scary Movie. And, Kevin Williamson I hadn't heard of or whatever. So I'm reading the script and I get, to the first scene and, with all the references to other horror movies. And I went, I kind of did this. Well, let me keep reading, and it was like, it was really good. And I, very well written. But I kept thinking, well, the tone of this is what I was doing with Friday. It was that, trying to be scary as well as people having a sense of humor and all the rest of that. So I turned it down. And about, I don't know, 2 months later, I'm reading all these other scripts that are terrible. And I call my agent back and I said, is that Scary Movie script still around? Wes Craven grabbed it. And I go, okay, he'll make it great. It'll be great. So I, and of course, had I made that decision, I would probably have a whole different career involved with that. But then, I don't know, maybe 10 years later or more, I got a meeting with Kevin Williamson on some new TV series that he was doing, because he did a number of those horror series. And, we're talking, I don't bring up the thing. And then finally he said, as I was leaving, I got to tell you something. Your Jason Lives had such an impact on me writing Scream. Wow. I said, okay, all right, thank you. Because I thought it was just me being arrogant or something. Oh, I already did this. I said, but I love to hear that happened. But no,
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Scream has that same sort of, comedy horror, perfectly balanced thing. So that makes a lot of sense.
And yet it's completely their own. I mean, it's not at all like a Friday or a Freddy or whatever, because obviously Freddy had lots of classic one-liners, that came and it's become most recently the movie. I'm just blanking on the title. Hard Eyes.
Hard Eyes, yeah.
Which I don't know if you've seen it or not, but
Yep.
what drew me to go see it is there was a article in Bloody Disgusting that said Jason Lives inspiration for Hard Eyes, and I went, what? So of course I ran out and saw the movie, and I went, I don't see it really. I mean, I get he's
Yeah.
doing like romantic comedy and he's doing horror, but he really made that his own.
Yeah.
But I contacted him anyway, and I just said, thank you for the nod. He goes, oh yeah. So we've become friends now. I went to lunch together. Incredible. Josh, incredibly nice guy, and
Yeah.
he came from comedy too. So that's his natural ability is to go that direction. And he loves horror. So he put the two things together. And it's of recent, it's probably been one of the more fun, horror movies.
Yeah. It feels like we're seeing things like, for example, Ryan Coogler with Sinners, you're seeing things where the things they grew up watching, it's like they're able to now be like, okay, let's try to combine this with this other genre, mix things together, try to create something new, which was great for the future of horror, that you can have. You'll still have always your serious horror films, but you have more comedy horror mixes now. Who knows what a horror will mix with next? Maybe they'll find a way to do horror action in a way that's like very interesting as well. So there's a lot you can do there. You said that actually, as far as the actual filming of Jason Lives, is one of the most fun times for you in terms of
it really was. I mean, when Joe Madri did this book and he was going, he saw everything I've ever made, whether it was a TV show, TV movie, anything that once kind of committed to film. He saw and put together what my life was at that time, what I was going through with having kids, whatever. And I suddenly went, how many? 42 films I've done that are basically feature films, whether they're for TV or for, cable or miniseries or theatrical. And it's like, I had no clue because, when you do this, if you're doing it to me, right, you don't look behind you. You just keep going towards the light. What else can I do? What else can I do? It literally was when I got to a point when I was copying Tom McLaughlin instead of finding something fresh to inspire me. And I got caught in that TV movie world, basically, television for women, working in Lifetime. But they wanted me because I could work, fast. I did all the research on the subject matter, whether it was teen sex or teen bullying or any of those other things that, since I had teenagers and I would go to schools and talk to the kids and, did as much research as I could do on the internet about subjects, and of course talk to women about their feelings about how much of that stuff did they carry with you, how did they think back on certain relationships, and of course, as opposed to us numbnuts, they can remember what song was on the radio when the guy broke out with them, or the shitty way they did it or whatever. And I realized, again, the sensitivity there and the smarts and the psychological difference between them. I don't like this dude, so I punched him. Holds it in and finds some other, Black Widow approach. There's lots of times between the horror movies that they go after. But it was a great education for me to do all these things that really were completely not stories that I would, seek out or knew really anything about. I really had to, research it. But I'm suddenly at a point where it's like I did so many things, I didn't fit into any box any longer, which is, in show business, it's not a great thing. They want to know, all right, we're doing a horror movie. We got Wes Craven, we got Clive Barker, we got Mick Garris, we got, they want to know that's what this person does. And one of the most telling things ever was I was sitting next to Wes Craven at one of these Masters of Horror dinners that Mick Garris put together for years. And Wes Craven turned to me and he said, I know you did a Friday the 13th. Excuse me, I don't remember which one. But what else have you done? And I started listing off all these different things. And he went, man, I want your career. I said, for Christ's sake. He said, no. I can't do anything else. They don't want anything else I've done has not been the success that they wanted it to be. And it's really frustrating that I can't get out of that box. And I said, well, like what was that thing called? The one on the plane.
Oh, Red Eye.
Red Eye. Yeah. I
Yeah.
said, that was a brilliant thriller. You
Yeah.
know, didn't that do well? And he said, not as well as A Nightmare on Elm Street or whatever.
Hmm.
And so again, that they keep going back, to where they think for sure they're going to have another moneymaker. And he said, I love hearing somebody that just, because I purposely jumped genres every movie. If I had just done a romantic comedy, now I'm going to do a thriller. Now I'm going to do a true crime. Now I'm going to do a Santa Claus movie. Now I'm going to, I just
Yeah.
kept grabbing these because I wanted that experience of trying different things out, see what else I might, learn, from the filmmaking. And if I have to go and study, one particular director or another to do enough background to feel solid, and then acknowledge, as I learned from Scorsese, you always bring up, I got this from this, I got that from that,
Hmm.
Quentin too is all about, yeah, I took this and took this and took,
Oh yeah.
I thought there's something wonderful about just admit it. Don't say, oh no, that's, get defensive about it. It's like, yeah, if that was your influence, acknowledge it, because nothing is original. It all comes from something else.
Yeah.
And to me, there's an excitement about saying to somebody, when they said that one sequence, it sort of felt like a Kubrick movie. That's exactly from The Shining.
Yeah.
And I would tell that to film students. Don't worry what the other students do with, yeah, I know where you got that. It's like, yeah, did you like the movie? Well, yeah, that was great. So did I. That's why it's in there. Period. End of story. Don't, defend
Yeah.
yourself.
It's like it's okay to use the same meat, but you're putting your spice on it. You're putting
Yeah.
your little ingredient on it, but maybe the base ingredients are still the same, but you can still make it taste different with your own spice attitude, right?
Yeah.
So
We're all different. We all have different backgrounds. Lots of times you don't think you're influencing your own stuff, but you are, like it or not. And if you can find, like this current thing I'm working on now, when I was living in Hollywood Tower a few years ago, there was a homeless guy that would walk down the sidewalk, and he had this huge, big, army green blanket that kind of went over his head. So, he looked like, a Star Wars, Jedi, and the thing dragged behind him, and you couldn't see
mm,
his face, and he just was like this specter, that walked down. And I thought, I got to do something with that, and
yeah.
this new thing that I'm working on, that was the perfect image. I says, okay, I've got to recreate that as part of what this character does at a certain point, to not be identified, just look like a homeless person walking through, but there's some vibe about that I picked up. So,
Mm,
you got to remember all these things that influence, or had an
yeah.
impact on you through your life. Sometimes it's completely subconscious, and other times it's very conscious.
Mm. Did you have a favorite scene in the film in Jason Lives?
That's always hard one to answer, because I can tell you what was the most difficult thing to get through the MPA, the censorship people, because we had 9 screenings for these guys.
Oh wow. Okay.
And the one they kept picking on over and over, and I had to keep taking frames out, was the sheriff kill, where he gets bent backwards. Not a drop
Mm.
of blood. All it is, one guy in a hole with his legs out, the sheriff out the other end of the
Oh.
hole, bending him back. It was a gag I did for Dick Van Dyke on a sketch called The Chiropractor, and we did the same basic
Mm.
idea of bending him like that, and it was for comedy. And I thought,
Yeah.
well, this could be intense. And then you add that crunching of the vertebrae going.
That
People
that
were
cracking noise gives me back spasms watching the movie because I'm like, that cracking noise does kind of get me a little bit.
so it never doesn't get a reaction. It was the
Yeah.
toughest thing to keep as much intact as possible. I had to cut out, one bend, two cuts out of it. But again, it didn't affect it really. It just having to play the game of, all right, no, we're cutting it down. But that, funny enough, really worked. And then the whole sequence that my ex-wife Nancy did, because she really wanted to be one of the campers, and I felt that she looked like she would be somebody overseeing the campers. I mean the camp counselors. And Tony Goldwyn, I'd hired, to play her sidekick, and of course he went on to great fame. But that whole sequence is sort of its own little short, Volkswagen coming down the road, Jason there. She says the line about seeing enough horror movies and knowing a guy in a mask is never friendly. He pulls out the gun. You ain't dirty, Harry, get in here. And
American Express was that was another funny, extremely funny moment. Yeah,
the button, as they call it in comedy, was the American Express, and I purposely left that shot, held on that shot a long time, because I believed, and I was absolutely right, that there would be somebody in the audience that would go, "Don't leave home without it." And the whole place would laugh, and I thought, okay, now I got the audience providing the punchline. And of course, whoever said it, he was so proud that he made everybody laugh. And to me, that was that sort of interactive way of making a movie.
It's funny. It's also actually kind of realistic. Like facing that situation, like you're gonna try to bargain with whatever you have in your pocket. So
Exactly.
pulling out the card is like, it's perfectly reasonable action that still gets the laugh. So it's perfect.
Yeah. And almost killed her too, because CJ was not a stunt coordinator. He just did what he was told by the stunt coordinator that was there. And one of the things was, we had one window there when after Tony Goldwyn was killed, that Jason had the spear, and he was supposed to go directly at where she was driving.
Okay.
And being Army man mentality, as she went across, he just naturally went with her. Didn't mean to, but he did. So when he slammed that spear through the glass, I mean, he missed her by like this. It was just
wow.
And it was incredible, but certainly nothing that I would want to say, well, we intended that. That was just a mistake. And he felt so bad because he thought, oh shit, I didn't hit you, did I? But that it was one of those things where everything had to be like a one-shot deal. The motorhome, same thing. We can't crash that more than once. That's it. And thank God, it worked.
Are you a fan of like just the idea of like test screenings in general, not necessarily like MPA, but just even when you're getting like the initial audience feedback to maybe make changes? Like I've heard other directors maybe not be a big fan of like test screening and how they do that and what they do with the data and what it means. Like, are you a fan of just the idea of like that, like you're getting that specific feedback from a specific audience and actually making big changes based on that?
It goes both ways. I'm a performer, and I only know when something works if they're laughing, if they're crying, if they're dead silent. To me, it's all about the audience. I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it to get a reaction, and hopefully it's what I intended. So when we start having these screenings, I mean, it can really screw you up, because Date with an Angel was a perfect example. Another one that had countless amount of screenings, because Dino De Laurentiis' company was going down fast. And I was watching Bruce Beresford film not work. Who else is it? William Friedkin, Peter Bogdanovich, all these people that the movies weren't working. They kept doing screenings. They kept changing things to please the audience. And then, of course, my turn, it was like, I mean, my original cut was like 2.5 hours. So I knew I had to take an hour out. But for whatever reason, every audience reacted differently to different things. So there was this guy, Joe Farrell, who had it's called the National Research Association or something. And they do these screenings. And he was the most powerful man in Hollywood, because whatever these notes that came back or the focus group afterwards, you tell that to the producers, and they go, turn to the writer, director, or the producer for the film. See, I told you that didn't work. And they would start cutting things.
1:30.
And you're trying to explain, well, wait a minute, this audience, had just seen 3 other things that day, and now they're they're tired, or, it's like, yeah, that's a hit song. They love that song. So of course that sequence, or they would say, well, we don't like Phoebe Cates in this movie. Well, you're not supposed to like her. She's the comic villain, you know.
Mm,
So you get screwed around with things. So Date with an Angel, at the end of it, it was not the movie I set out to make in terms of like a romantic, comedy, fantasy comedy. And comedy was supposed to be sort of the last thing, but it ended up getting cut to be more about the jokes and the 80s music. There's
mm,
people that just, absolutely love the film, but it was the one that was going to be for me, you know, my ET or
right.
Splash. But I'd written those things before ET, and Splash and Mannequin. But by the time it came out, the first thing the critics did is, okay, well, now we got an angel. All right, you just obviously saw this movie, and it's like completely not true. But it all depends on kind of when something gets out and when they see it. Um,
Right.
when we did One Dark Night, um, the the DP on ET was a friend with our DP, and came into the cutting room, and he saw a sequence where the corpses, were all pushing against the girls and all that, and he said, "When are you guys releasing this?" And I said, "Well, in 2 months." They go, "Oh, good, because yeah, Poltergeist is coming, and I've seen some of that, very similar, except
Mm,
water, and and Joe Beth was in that way." But sure as shit, when we didn't go for another year, so when it came out immediately, it was like we were ripping off Poltergeist.
mm,
I saw first.
yeah.
Nothing you can do about that. It's just
Right.
you know.
What did you enjoy? What they eventually did with Freddy vs. Jason, like the actual Freddy vs. Jason movie, in terms of like how they did figure out a way to kind of bring their stories together and everything.
Um, well, I actually went in with a version for that. I got, my agent said, "Do you have any idea?" Because they're going to make this thing, and I said, "Well, I have an idea, but I'm pretty 100% sure they're not going to go for it. But to me, this is the only thing that, in my mind, would work and be scary, but it's going to disappoint a lot of people to do it this way, which is when we had all these people that hated the violence in horror movies and were blaming murders and kids shooting people or kids killing people on these movies. And
Mhm.
they made a huge, big thing about that. And I was watching something on HBO, a documentary on kids who kill.
Mm,
And they were interviewing this kid in prison, and he said, you killed your best friend's mother.
mm,
Yeah, she's a bitch, and it's like, well, what was going through your head when you were doing this, stabbing her? I was Jason. I was Jason. There was no fear. And
mm.
then they cut to my poster and slowly move in. And I'm going, oh,
Oh,
fuck me.
damn.
Doggone it. I did not want that kind of thing associated with it, even though I know it's not true in the same
Right.
way, you know, Rob Zombie's or Marilyn Manson's music made people go out and kill or do what they do with devil worship or whatever.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a fire in somebody, and yes, these kings can definitely throw gasoline on that fire, but it's not that everybody reacts that way. It's
And it's
one
up
in a
to
million.
it's always up to the parents to decide, at what age should our children watch these things and
Yeah.
what amount of exposure they can have. So, to me, it's always goes back to the parenting on those things as well. So,
So based on that emotional reaction I had, it's like, what if there were two kids that killed and they're in one of these? Because I was also teaching writing at juvenile hall, which was a hell of an experience to be locked in a room at juvenile hall with 15 kids between 12 and 18 who were major criminals. Either they had killed a number of people, robbed, gangs or whatever. And I'm supposed to go in and talk to these guys about writing.
mm,
And what a lot of them did was they did it in rap. And at that point I had no connection with rap, but now I did. Now I could
mm,
hear what they were talking about. Now I understood. It really was a great thing for me. And when I then started working with the females at the other uh, juvenile hall with girls, there was girls in there that were 14 years old on their second baby. and they would have the baby in there taken away. And there was so much emotion with these girls, because they just grew up so damn fast. And, or it's like, it was a cliche that most of the kids in there, fathers had left or were in prison, mothers had two jobs, and the kids grew up on the streets. And they got a gun when they were 8 or 9, and that was the power. And if a young kid was a father, he would steal diapers from a store and then get caught, and that could be his third offense. So he was tossed in there because it was like 3 offenses, and in you go. But it really got me into that whole thing of, what do you think about when you do what you do? Are you really feeling vengeful, or do you become somebody else? So I thought, what if one kid really identified with Freddy and the other one really identified with Jason, and they're in this place, and at a certain point they literally become what they feel they are. If they looked in the mirror, that's what they saw. And when they killed in that style. And at some point, they end up fighting each other. So it was like a psychological thing more than that's really real. What we see on the screen looks very real. And I knew it didn't take long for them to go, no, 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 we don't want to do that. It's got to be Jason. It's got to be Freddy. I go,
I would
I
like
got
it,
it.
but
I got it.
I'd have been into it.
But again, that was coming from something that I had experienced and had an emotional reaction to, which is why I even pitched it. But I knew there would be that thing of, no, they somehow want people to figure out how to do this kind of fantasy horror with these two guys. And it worked. Obviously, it did really well. And there's a lot of huge fans of it. So, I never say the public's wrong. If they like it, it means something,
But Tom, this has been an absolute pleasure. Gotta have you back sometime. This made this a great Friday 13th month for me, so I appreciate it. And just all the best. And like I said, let's definitely do this again.
I'd love to.